And I will mute you all during the recording period. Once that's concluded, you will need to unmute yourselves. I can keep you from talking, but I can't allow you to talk. So you'll have to take on that responsibility once the presentation part is concluded. And I really look forward to hearing your thoughts and reflections, whether in the larger group when we're done or in the smaller groups for our conversation. And I want to start by thanking you for being here during this 6-week period, as together we've explored our country's history, much of which we didn't learn in school. As we've seen during our time together, much of the racial turmoil in our country today can be traced directly to elements of our history, even before the founding of the United States. Many of the racial stereotypes that we hear or that we hold ourselves are a direct consequence of public and economic policy, intentional public and economic policy, and biased beliefs that have no grounding in genetics or biology. Now that we more deeply understand the history of our country and the myriad ways that bigotry and discrimination are embedded in our society, we turn our attention to the question, so what are we going to do about it? We have seen much about our country's history in these weeks together that cry out for action, for reform. Much of the historic economic discrimination will take decades or longer to address in comprehensive ways. But we have it within our ability to take meaningful action on issues of criminal justice and voting rights reform, alleviating poverty, addressing inequity in education. It is essential that we do so, that we make our voices heard so that theirs may be heard as well. And there is another aspect of action that is less concrete, but equally important. One that addresses our personal beliefs that are based on our individual histories, our families, our education, our experiences. Examining those beliefs, surfacing what is called unconscious bias, implicit bias, is an important step in our ability to identify and counter racism in its many manifestations. Our class this evening will take what we've learned and use it as a catalyst for action. I have some thoughts to share with you this evening, and I look forward to hearing your perspectives as we engage in a meaningful path forward to a more just and equitable society. Together, we will look ahead to use our deeper understanding of our country's history to shape our future actions as we indeed seek peace and justice for all. So, as is our custom, we take a quick look back at last week, where we looked at the issues of voting rights and voter suppression. We looked at our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution and its amendments, legislative actions, and pivotal Supreme Court decisions. We considered the 15th Amendment that explicitly dealt with voting rights and the end of the period of Reconstruction that ushered in 100 years of powerful voter suppression tactics that accelerate to the present. We looked at the power and the potential embedded in the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the devastation wrought by the Supreme Court decision of Shelby v. Holder. We considered actions being taken across the country in states addressing voter ID laws, voter roll purges, the limitation of resources to polling places and to precincts. And we ask ourselves, is voting a right or is it a privilege? And who says, who gets to say? What is the role of government in a system like ours, where the power to govern comes from the consent of the governed? Is the government responsible to facilitate voting or to constrain it? And we know that this assault on voting rights is accelerating in many places. In others, states have turned in the opposite direction. So it can be done. It is possible. And we need to understand where and how and why these actions are being taken. Some interesting, just snapshot of statistics here. The demographics for the 2020 election, the population by race, as defined by race. Whites make up 61.6% of the population, and they made up 67% of those who voted. So significantly overrepresented in the population to vote. Black people, 12.4% of the population, and just slightly more than that voting, 13%. The Hispanic population is almost 19%, but only 13% voted. Asian was 6 and 4, and other, 1.3% of the population, 4% of those who voted. In terms of gender, females in 2020 made up 50.8% of the population and were 52% of the voting population, and males 49.2 and 48. Just a snapshot. So as we come to the end of this series and we look back, we began by focusing on the early years, 1619 to 1865. And then we turned our attention to a hugely pivotal but relatively little known period of our history that labeled slavery by another name, Reconstruction, the passage of Black codes, convict leasing, the incredible impact of Jim Crow laws and segregation enforced by violence. We turned our attention then to the 20th century and some key aspects of public policy and the pivotal events of the civil rights movement. And I think it's important as we look at the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, it was an inflection point in our racial history, and it offered opportunities for significant shift. And I think what that has the potential to offer is hope that the same might happen again, but only with the kinds of heroic actions and considered efforts of people dedicated to seeing that civil rights were enacted and enhanced in our country. We looked at mass incarceration and the war on drugs and the impact on our criminal justice system, and of course, voter suppression then and now. And today we say, knowing all of this, where do we go from here? I'm going to revisit a couple of definitions that we covered in the first class. Prejudice is an unfavorable opinion formed often without personal knowledge, thought, or reason. And that personal knowledge is important. If we do not know one another, then something has to fill the void. And it is often what we hear or what people say or stereotypes that have developed over time. White supremacy, in this instance, is intentional. It is punitive. It is the default in our country. It is accepted, that system, that white people are inherently superior to people from other racial groups and are therefore rightfully the dominant group in any society. Racism is that discrimination, that profound impact directed against people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group. And racism is not just a comment or a feeling or a thought or an action. It is a system of prejudice backed by power. And white power, we have seen, has been exercised dramatically throughout our country's history. So now we shift our attention from our history to our future, with the hope that we use our deeper understanding of our past to shape our future actions. And so we ask ourselves, what have we learned in these 5 or 6 weeks? How are we impacted by what we now know? How are we different? Are there things that we see differently in today's world, recognizing how our present is grounded in our past? And if we now see a pattern of white supremacy, of discrimination, what do we need to do individually and, importantly, collectively? Because it is in that collective action that power lies, that change can happen. Might we feel a new or a renewed urgency to act, to address the inequities that are so profound and so prevalent, and now so much, presumably, even more clear? So, what have we learned? We learned that from 1619 to 1865, the institution of slavery created and sustained an underclass of people. And that system necessitated a belief in Black inferiority. And what we know is that in 1865, the institution, the legal construct, ended, but that belief did not. And we have never addressed it as a country. We saw how segregation as law until 1964 embodied and perpetuated white supremacy. Separate but equal was ostensibly the law of the land after the Plessy v. Ferguson decision in 1896. Separate for sure, equal not. And when not equal, the white side was always superior. We looked at intentional public policy, specifically in the 20th century, and how those actions taken systematically disadvantaged Black people in housing, in education, in benefits, jobs, the criminal justice system, voting. And so what we see is that the roots of today's inequality are deeply embedded in our country. They did not just spring out of whole cloth here recently. It is a significant part of who we are, who our country is. So how does this affect us? I believe there is so much that we never knew, that we didn't understand, that we didn't recognize, that we didn't see. And I think we have to ask ourselves, why not? Why did we not see this? How could it have escaped our notice? And how do we keep that from being the norm going forward? We know that the key legacy of Jim Crow, of segregation, has been isolation from one another. And that segregation in all aspects of public life, but particularly in housing. So many of us live in segregated communities, an outgrowth of all of those Jim Crow laws and the policies implemented subsequently. Studies have shown that 75% of adult white Americans do not have a single Black friend. Someone that they travel with, someone that they have to dinner, someone that they regularly socialize with. That profound segregation continues in so many parts of our country. And that lack of knowledge, that lack of connecting with one another as fellow human beings, fellow parents, fellow workers, fellow women, fellow men, has resulted in a lack of understanding. And on the part of white people, a lack of empathy, a lack of awareness of what it's like to be Black in America. And if we don't have that personal knowledge, what fills the vacuum are stereotypes. They flourish in the absence of information, of knowledge. And the media intensifies those stereotypes in hugely significant ways with both overt and subliminal messaging. I was going to say 40 years ago. It's almost 50 years ago. How's that possible? I took a class at DuPont, and it was called Developing Effective Black-White Relationships. And it was aimed at 20 white supervisors, managers in DuPont. How we were selected, we didn't know. When we first met, there was a little bit of the deer in the headlights. Am I here because somebody thinks I might learn something from this, or am I here because I'm one of those who most desperately needs this education? But in any case, there were 20 white supervisor managers at DuPont, and then there were 2 Black DuPont employees. And the class was facilitated by 2 African-American men from San Francisco who had been brought in to conduct this program. And one of the first things they said to try to put us at ease was to explain that the 2 Black DuPont employees were there because part of the responsibility of these facilitators was to describe to us white managers the way the world works, the way things are. And the expectation was that as white DuPont managers, we would say, well, that may be true other places, but it's not true here at DuPont. And so, if appropriate, the role of the Black DuPont employers was to say, well, actually, yes. I will never forget one of those individuals. They were a man and a woman, each from one of the Southern DuPont plants, because there weren't a lot of Black people at headquarters. And one of them related that the monthly meetings of the local Ku Klux Klan chapter were held in the conference room at the DuPont plant at the invitation of the plant manager. And so one of the points that these facilitators made was, you cannot have grown up in the United States of America in the 20th century and not be prejudiced against Black people. It is not possible. It may not be intentional, it may not be conscious, but we have been bombarded by messaging that we have assimilated one way or another, consciously or unconsciously. So they wanted us to just set aside that phrase, well, I'm not prejudiced, and to say, it is simply a fact. It is not possible that you did not absorb any of this messaging, whether from family or friends or neighbors or media or whatever. So they asked us to set that defensive position aside. So how does the media play a role? Well, here's a chart. Not going to worry too much about the detail, but you can see that there's a blue bar that is shorter than the red bar. And there are three categories of crimes. This was taking place in New York City in 4 months of 2014. We know from our investigation of the criminal justice system that a disproportionate number of Black people are arrested as potentially committing crimes. So that being said, 54% of those arrested and suspected of murder were Black, 55% of those arrested and accused of theft were Black, 49% of those arrested and accused of assault were Black. But the representation of them in news reports was dramatically different. 54% Black people arrested for murder, but they represented 74% of the people shown in the media as murder suspects. 55% of those arrested for suspicion of theft, yet they were represented 84% of the time in media reports. And assault, 49 and 73%. You know, I saw a promotional piece for a program on how to avoid carjacking. And it was designed to give the ordinary person some tips and some tools to avoid being carjacked. And there was a picture of a car being carjacked by an African-American man. Probably didn't have to be, but it was. I find this particular, we can come up with thousands, hundreds of thousands of these examples, but this one really struck me because this is from a single news program on March 23rd, 2015. And early in the program, there was a report about 3 University of Iowa wrestlers who had been arrested and charged with burglary. Fine, upstanding, clean-cut young men, coat and tie, look pretty responsible. I don't know about that. And minutes later, another news report, Coralville police arrest 4 in a burglary investigation. They don't look quite so upstanding and responsible, do they? And on and on. And once I became aware of this, it's everywhere. It is everywhere. And that's part of the messaging. Nobody said in doing this news report, these white young men probably didn't commit burglary and these Black guys surely did, but it's out there, it's in the ether, it's in what we read and what we breathe and what we see and what we hear. And so as a consequence, particularly of the stereotypes and the messaging, We develop biases that are triggered automatically and unintentionally. Often we don't even know that they're there. So in this class I took 50 years ago, the instructors began by saying to the white managers, we've got some chart pads here, and we would like you to tell us all of the words, the adjectives, the nouns, the whatever, all the words that you think of when you think of a Black person. What comes to mind? As you might imagine, there was silence for quite some time, and the facilitators were wise enough not to say any more. And finally, one brave white person said, exotic. Oh, okay, write that down. And then somebody else said athletic. Write that down. Jazz. Write that down. Musical. I think there were 7 or 8 more words, and then the energy just left the discussion. Whereupon the facilitator said, "Oh, I'm sorry. We weren't clear about our instructions for this. We weren't asking you what you think. We're asking you what you've heard." So we filled 11 chart pad pages with rapist, murderer, criminal, sexual abuser, violator. 11 chart pad pages. And then they said to the 2 Black deponers, okay, so what comes to mind for you when you think about white people? And they said entitled, discriminatory, superior, privileged. About 2/3 of a page. And so the facilitator said, so what do you get from this? And a couple of the white managers said, I am not privileged. I'm not entitled. I'm not condescending. I'm not. And I'm looking at 11 chart pad pages of the most horrific terms. And I'm thinking, what must it be like to leave your home in the morning and go out into a community that sees you? And these are the words that come to mind. I can't imagine. We do know, based on all sorts of studies and all sorts of data, that in general, in circumstances, white people in our society are presumed to be competent until they prove that they're not. Doesn't take some people very long, takes others. Anyway, Black people, on the other hand, are, as a norm, assumed to be not necessarily competent until they prove that they are. You may have read about studies that were done. Some were done by TV networks. There have been others done by universities, where they took identical resumes and they submitted them for a particular position. But the name at the top of one version of the resume was the equivalent of John Smith. And the name at the top of the other resume was the equivalent of Hakeem Jeffries. And then they measured the callback rates and the interview rates and the job offer rates. And the distinction was striking and universal. And so one of the other aspects of implicit bias and how does it play out is I ask myself, and I don't know what your circumstance would be, is my doctor white or black? Is my dentist white or black? Is my attorney white or black? Are my neighbors white or black? So I'm making decisions. Maybe it's random, maybe it's irrelevant, but there is a pattern that at least implies there's something going on. If you have not done so, I encourage each of you to take the Harvard University implicit bias test. It has been given to literally millions of people, and it helps to assess, not perfectly certainly, but with some considerable power, the level of implicit bias that we hold. And once you've taken it, you can't take it again. So I thought perhaps that was possible, but you need to identify yourself. I guess you could make up another name and another email address, but you take the test and it gives you an assessment of how implicit bias shows up in your responses to the test. So I encourage you to take it. So given all of this, and given where we are, given the personal nature of our attitudes, our beliefs, our experiences, our feelings, it requires that we take personal responsibility for these beliefs, for these values, for these actions, especially the white people who are here, to confront and acknowledge where we hold biases. It's not a crime. It's not a sin. It is, as our facilitators told us, a reality. And so the gift and the value is uncovering these biases in a way that we can deal with them, address them, utilize them. So what's next? And I say, particularly to the white people here, we need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's okay. In fact, it's necessary. It's growth. To do some self-examination in the area of racial attitudes and beliefs. It's not easy. We have attitudes and behaviors that perhaps have been ours for a very long time. And to uncover what lies beneath them can be a challenge. What's involved is some continuing education and dialogue, especially cross-racial dialogue, to share thoughts, to ask questions, to build knowledge, and to listen for understanding. It is very easy for me as a white person to have a Black person tell me about an experience they had that they saw as being denigrating or discriminatory. And for me to respond, oh, I don't think they meant that. I don't think that was what was intended. When perhaps it was exactly intended. As I said earlier, it is very difficult, if not impossible, for us white people to feel, to know what it is to be Black in the United States of America. But we can learn, and we can begin to see circumstances and situations. Some of them are described as microaggressions. Statements, comments that on the surface don't seem like any big deal, But when you are bombarded with them or confronted with them repeatedly during your daily life, they are powerful and can be debilitating. My friend Alma Scott, who lives in Wilmington, and founded a group called Race Talk, where she encouraged these kinds of dialogues and discussions. And the groups used to meet at different people's homes. Alma was the only Black person in the group. She facilitated these dialogues. And after a number of meetings, 1 month, the meeting was at her house. She lives in the Highlands in Wilmington, and she was letting people in so that they could have some refreshments and begin their conversation. And the doorbell rang, and she went to the doorbell, and there was a younger-ish white man there. And when she opened the door and said, "Good evening, I'm Alma Scott," and he gave his name, and the next thing he said to her is, "Are you renting?" And it takes my breath away. And yet, for someone else, it would be not an issue, but it implies you probably can't afford to buy this place, so perhaps you're renting. Anyway, having those kinds of conversations, developing a better understanding of one another, getting to know one another on a personal basis can help lead to identifying some actions that could be taken. What needs to be done, first of all, and then given that, what can I do? How could I make a difference? Any one of us. And then make a personal commitment. Here's what I will do to help make a difference. We know that these issues are enormous and intractable and won't be solved in our lifetimes, but we can take small steps and we can make a difference. And so in the context of self-examination, one of the things that's important to do is to observe ourselves. Again, particularly white people, when we find ourselves in situations where race is a factor. Much of our lives are lived with other white people, and race is not a present issue. But when it is, observing how we feel, what we think, how we respond, how we react to something someone else says, and then reflecting on those thoughts and feelings. Does that make sense? Why am I feeling that way? Would I or wouldn't I do the same if this were another white person? And then monitoring our reactions, being self-aware. So I have been doing what was called diversity work back in the day. It might be called any one of a number of things in our current circumstance. And so I began to feel like I was pretty well evolved in all of this. Still had some issues, clearly, but I recognized them, I understood them, I tried to deal with them. Until one October, a few years ago, my husband Bob and I were actually with one of the participants in tonight's class, Joan and her husband Blake. We were in Washington, D.C. for a long weekend, Columbus Day. And as we were getting ready to leave to come home, we got a phone call from our cleaning lady who comes every couple weeks. And she was here when a 100-foot pine tree collapsed and fell on the roof of our house. And when we came home, we saw that there had been some pretty significant damage to the roof and to the ceiling and to some of the decking. And so we needed to contact the insurance company and get a company to come out and remove the tree. But it became clear when we looked at it that the way the fallen tree had embedded itself in decking and the buildings, that it was entirely possible that in removing the tree, they were going to do more damage than had been caused when the tree initially fell. And so I was very apprehensive. I was sitting in the living room, worried, when all of a sudden there was this incredible thud and the whole house shook. And I looked up and I saw that the crew chief was white, and I felt better. So feeling that, recognizing that, understanding that, what are the things that can be done to reshape those unintentional automatic responses? What does it say that that was my thought? Do I really think only a white crew chief could be effective at managing this project? And one of the things that's most helpful of self-examination is to have a partner, somebody who can help us see ourselves when we can't all alone. Somebody that you trust, who, if they said to you, you know, what you just said is probably not what you really wanted to say, or really, was that really what you meant? Or are you aware of how that came across? Because sometimes we just can't see it. That's what happens with implicit biases. They are unconscious, they're not visible. So find a partner, find a friend, maybe somebody that you could each do it for, with some mutual growth and learning and awareness. Certainly there are incredible opportunities for continuing education, an incredible range of books, of videos, of articles. There are amazing museums, the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. Just so that you're aware, the Delaware Episcopal Church and Newcastle Presbytery are sponsoring a pilgrimage to Montgomery and Selma, Alabama in September. And it's an opportunity to experience those locations in a way that help build knowledge and personal experience. There are applications available for people who want to participate in that pilgrimage. If you're interested, let me know. And there are certainly other classes and discussion groups that are constantly underway. Just a few recommended books, and I suspect that you have others that you would add to this list. One of the first ones that I read in beginning this journey was America's Original Sin by Jim Wallace. Then Carol Anderson, who is a professor of African American Studies at the University of South Carolina, has written both White Rage and One Person, No Vote. As you can imagine, One Person, No Vote relates to the voter suppression actions that we're studying. But White Rage, she wrote in response to someone asking her, as an African American scholar, why is it that Black people are so angry? Why is it that they are rioting, they are enraged, they are causing all of these problems? And she began to do some historical research and brought to light the idea of Black progress, white backlash, and that is an occurrence that replicates itself again and again in our society. White Fragility is an excellent book by Robin DiAngelo, and I'll talk in a minute about a video that she has done. Just Mercy is a wonderful book and movie by Brian Stevenson. Isabel Wilkerson has written a tome, but worth every minute, on the Great Migration, called The Warmth of Other Suns. And her more recent book is Caste, where she likens the racial divide in America to the caste systems in South Africa and India. The Color of Law is Richard Rothstein's book describing the public and economic policy that has embedded discrimination in our communities and our society. The Sum of Us was a book actually that Westminster Presbyterian Church read as a One Book, One Church a number of years ago. And there's a new one out just now by a man named Keith Boykin that asks the question, why does everything have to be about race? And he answers that question compellingly. There is an amazing video series called Race, the Power of an Illusion, put out by PBS, that makes quite clear that race is not a biologic or genetic reality, but a social construct, and that has enormous power, even though it is not a physical reality. There's a wonderful documentary put out just last year, I think, Who We Are, A Chronicle of Racism in America. It's a Netflix film. It takes this 6-week class and it condenses it to 2 hours. And Jeffrey Robinson is phenomenal in telling the story. I highly, highly recommend that. If you don't have a Netflix account, call me up, come on over, we'll have popcorn and a glass of wine and we'll watch it. I'll take care of that. 1619 is on Hulu. The video I mentioned by Robin DiAngelo is called Deconstructing White Privilege. It's about a 25-minute video. And it explains white privilege in compelling ways. I think I have watched that video at least a dozen times, and I get something else out of it every time I watch it. If you go to TED Talks and you Google racism in America, you'll get a ton of programs that are extraordinarily insightful. 13th is the documentary by Ava DuVernay that looks at the legacy of the loophole in the 13th Amendment. And then on a simplistic level, Race in America has 2 parts. It's developed by Phil Vischer, who, according to people of a different generation than I, whose kids watched VeggieTales, Phil Vischer created VeggieTales. And when he was done with that, he turned his attention to race. And these are presented in a very simple and straightforward manner, but they get the message across. Some recommended articles I would propose is The History of the Idea of Race. Again, it's not a biological reality. And then the Equal Justice Initiative keeps issuing incredibly detailed, incredibly well-researched reports on various aspects of race in America. Initially, I think you could buy these beautiful books for $4. Now they're $6. But they are full of incredible information. I think there was a question last week about what were some of the sources of the research that I've done, and clearly these Equal Justice Initiative reports are powerful sources of information. And then in October of 2014, author Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote an article for The Atlantic. You can read it even if you don't have a subscription to The Atlantic, and it is The Case for Reparations. And it is a really powerful exposition of why reparations are something that should be considered in the United States to help rectify the damage that has been done and that continues. There's tremendous opportunities for dialogue in discussion groups. The YWCA offers a continuing series of these discussion groups. Some of them deal with how to be an effective white ally, how to help address circumstances and situations where people make statements, make comments that are wrong or inappropriate, and our tendency may be not to say anything. Are you in a book group? Could you suggest one of these books for the group to read? Or would you join a book group that is focused on issues of racial equity and racial justice? How do we seek to build meaningful cross-racial relationships? And when we do, how to listen for understanding. It's been said that white people, when confronted with stories of discrimination, invoke the 3 Ds: deny, deflect, defend. It's a natural tendency, but there are ways to get past that. And then importantly, again, especially for white people in this group, to speak up, share what we've learned, especially when people express racist comments. I had a boss once who said the best way to deal with a problem is to consider the circumstance, quote, out of the heat of battle. So I know there are people who are likely to make comments like that. I need to think about it ahead of time. I need to be prepared so that the circumstance doesn't arise. I'm silent. And when I get home, I say, I could have had a V8. Think about it ahead of time. Practice what we could say. That's not my experience. Simply, I don't agree. I don't agree with that. Or actually, and provide a fact. Fact may not always help, but it doesn't necessarily hurt. I used to think that, but I learned. Or tell me why you say that. What's your experience that leads you to that conclusion? And particularly in the case of these microaggressions, surface them, speak up, because indeed silence implies assent. And sometimes it's just, I don't want to rock the boat. I know this isn't going anywhere. I'm going to change anything. But think about being in a position where you are the person to whom those comments are being directed, and any response you come up with is automatically seen as defensive and reactionary and inappropriate. So how much better to be an ally, to make a statement, to be on record? Not that hard. So I ask each of you as we come to the end of this class series, we know, we've seen that the issues are enormous. They are everywhere and they cannot all be fixed, and we cannot be involved in all of them. So in addition to this focus on personal growth and learning and experiences, there's an opportunity and a need to take meaningful action. And so a way to approach it might be to say, what issue speaks to your heart? What is the one that moves you? And it may very well be different for every single one of us, which actually is fine. It could be voting rights. It could be criminal justice and police reform. It could be education, equity, affordable housing, environmental justice, reparations. The list goes on and on. But particularly as you reflect on all that you've heard during this period of our time together, what is the one that calls to you, to your heart, to say, this is something I need to do, I want to do? Because anytime we have that emotional connection, it is not dragging someone kicking and screaming to check a box and say, all right, I did something. It is, I feel moved to get involved and to take action. And it need not be done alone. In fact, other than, well, it need not, it shouldn't. So there are opportunities to join advocacy groups, other people already active, involved in taking action, in making a difference, in creating change, and seek opportunities to work together with other people that you find who have similar goals, similar values, similar drive. And make your voice heard in conversations, in organizational leadership, in calling our representatives. Bombard them with your position on legislative initiatives or comments made in public circumstances. Make your voice heard. There's also an opportunity for what I call personal reparations. Patronize Black-owned businesses. There are firms in our community who actually focus on hiring returning citizens, people who have been incarcerated. They are now returning to the community. One of the major hurdles they often face is getting a job. And there are companies in our community who make it a practice of hiring returning citizens to help them get back on their feet and be a functioning part of their community. Engage them, hire them, and contribute to or volunteer with Black-led organizations. We don't always have to be in charge. There are opportunities to work with others. There are a host of Delaware advocacy groups. For any issue, there's at least 1 or 2 or 10. That's sometimes the problem. If they coordinated better, more might get accomplished. But there are so many effective, active organizations seeking to do this work. We don't have to start it from the ground up. We can join in, we can add our voices, we can add our energy to make something happen. So here we are. What got me off the couch? It began in 2012 with Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, a 14-year-old with an air gun in a park, shot to death by police. Alton Sterling, Stephen Clark, Botham Jean, Laquan McDonald, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Walter Scott, Antoine Rose, Sweet Elijah McClain, Eric Garner, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Tyree Nichols, and hundreds and thousands more. Eddie Glaude is a professor and head of the African American Studies Department at Princeton University. He often appears on television, often on MSNBC programs. I always look forward to hearing what he has to say. He doesn't let me slide, but he is effective in the challenges that he puts forth. And he's recently written a book based on the writings and the life of James Baldwin. And in talking about that book, he related that there was one question that James Baldwin kept getting when he was being interviewed as a new book came out or as he was giving a talk. And a white reporter or a white person would say to him, "What does the Negro want?" And he responded by saying, "What do you want? You want fairness, you want justice, you want opportunity, you want safety. That's what the Negro wants. It's not magic." So, asking each of us today, what is your conception of justice? Should some people be valued more than others because of the color of their skin? Black people are dying because of racism, because of the violence I described on that previous chart, because of police action, because of health inequities, food deserts, poverty, poor nutrition, access to health care, stress-related comorbidities, maternal and infant mortality. In October 2018, the U.S. Census Bureau created a comprehensive census tract level data set covering nearly the entire U.S. population. Life expectancy is a fundamental indicator of inequality. Researchers focus on life expectancy as the broadest possible dimension of privilege. The life expectancy for a child born in Centerville, Delaware, exceeds that of a child born in Wilmington near East 12th Street by 18 years, almost 2 decades. These census tracts are less than 6 miles apart. Is that justice? Racism hurts all of us. Our country is at risk. We must act. So, what's next? Self-examination, continuing education and dialogue, action. If each of us makes a personal commitment, it will matter. And vote. So as we go into our small groups, offer you some thoughts to consider reflecting on. What here in this class series has had the most significance for you? What inequities call out to you? And you don't have to answer it in a small group. Answer it in a quiet place. What will be your commitment, your action to make a difference?